right. This is great. I'm excited about this, Ted. Last week or last month, you did a dev camp on the really cool translation tool that was an add-in to the desktop that you built to help build out to take care of a special purpose. It was really an inventive kind of a thing that I thought was really cool to see. And I was kind of fascinated both from that perspective of like how that tool worked, but also kind of how you tapped into the desktop to be able to extend it and take advantage of additional, bring additional features into it. I mean, we already know that there's other tools that are out there that, everybody knows, the plugins, the DAX Studios and the ALM, the other things like that I'm sure you'll talk about. But just that extensibility is pretty powerful. And so I understand this is what you're going to talk about today, and I'm excited to hear about it.
Well, thanks, Scott. So last month I, showed building an external tool, Translations Builder, just to kind of really reach, Power BI desktop authors that were, working on projects to have multi-language reports. But I did a lot of work with that external tool. And so what I thought is, can I take that learning experience and kind of share it with everyone, who's a developer, who wants to kind of go down this road. And so, what we're going to look at today, is basically, how to build an external tool. And so, what we'll see is I'll just start with some basic fundamentals of building external tools with Power BI Desktop. And I have one demo application, that is going to show techniques. Anyone here, who wants to build their own external tool can use this, as a starter project. We're going to have to look at the Tabular Object Model, our buddy Tom, that we use to program datasets with .NET and C#. And then in our second to last section, I'm going to step through just some of the, tasks that you can automate. So what I'll call productivity features that I would build into my external tool for a Power BI desktop author like you, Scott. And then at the very end, go ahead. You're going to say.
No, that's great. This is cool. I mean, if you have a chance, and you probably were going to share a little bit about kind of what's kind of the audience that would typically tackle a problem like this, but I'm excited to hear about what everything you're to share.
Okay, well, let's kind of start. We're developing an external tool. So the first thing, Scott, this is really for software developers, not so much for humans. And what we'd like to do is we'd like to, take the tools that we like to use, Visual Studio Code, Visual Studio, and, build, some type of a project. And so an external tool is a custom application you build to be a sidekick to Power BI Desktop. And the idea is that our code is going to be able to make a connection, through something called the XMLA endpoint, and then it's going to be able to connect to our data set. And so what we want to show, in this session is, real world things, that you can do, with this style of development, that has a lot of value to you or other people, using Power BI Desktop. Now, when you install an external tool, it will then show up in the external tools tab. So there are a lot of popular external tools that, if you're familiar with Power BI and moving towards, medium to advanced authoring in Power BI Desktop, you probably have heard of Tabular Editor 2, DAX Studio, ALM Studio. The one I'm going to talk about at the end, Translation Builder. I'm not going to show it, but I wanted to call out that the SQL BI folks had kind of put together a community project, to build an external tool called Bravo. It's up on GitHub. If you want to contribute to something, if you like the session here, that's something to look into. Now, quick walk down memory lane, all our favorite external tools that we have today. There's Tabular Editor 2, which is an amazing tool. It was created by this guy named Daniel Oaktier. I think it's much easier just to remember him as Dano. Remember,
Book him,
Dano. Anyway, this guy put so many hours into building this tool that's going to use the exact same API that we're going to look at, basically to build a Tabular Editor 2. Another amazing tool, DAX Studio. Scott and I are lucky enough to have the creator of that tool on our team, Darren Gospel. But this is just a highly, popular tool for, figuring out how to run queries, optimizing queries, things like that. And then the last one I want to call out is the ALM toolkit. So this is a great tool that allows you to, basically connect to your local data set in Power BI desktop, connect to your production data set up in the Power BI service, and basically run a diff to see what's the difference between the two, and to basically push changes from one to the other. Once again, if you've never worked with this tool and you want to look for advanced options in application lifecycle management, this is the real thing.
That's from our friend Christian Wade.
Our friend Christian Wade,
Mr. Clicky Draggy Dropping himself.
He created it before he came to Microsoft, and then once we found out he did it, we basically took him out of the public sector. We acquired him, captured him. Anyway, now there's two connection models. So the first one, Scott, is the one we're going to talk about today. And that is when, whether I'm using Power or a tabular editor on my machine, or I'm creating my own custom tool, it's going to just work locally. I could basically do this on an airplane with no internet connection. I'm just going to connect straight to the data set that's running locally in memory. Mode number 2 with the tabular object model is that you can connect, to a data set running, in the Power BI service and do the same kind of things. Now, if you look at the two sub-bullets under Model 1 and Model 2, Model number 1, when we talk, to a data set in Power BI desktop, we don't have full access to what's in TOM. When we write code against the data set, inside of a workspace, you have, complete access to use everything that the tabular object model. So Power BI desktop, does put some constraints on it. Just to kind of limit what those are, there is, this Microsoft documentation, and I will tell you up front, it's a little bit more strict than it should be. So it says you can define and edit measures for calculations, create calculation groups. We can create perspectives, which we don't really care about unless we're, using Excel to connect to it. We can work with metadata translations, so that's what Translation Builder does. Or if you want to automate, adding or managing row-level security roles, that's good. Under data modeling limitations, it will say, any TOM operations not covered, write operations for tables and columns. That's not entirely true. So at a high level, what you can't do is you can't create an outbound connection. But if you create a table that has DAX behind it, that's allowed. And you can certainly add columns and measures. So we have a long-term project we're working on, which is taking the data set format and going through a process called hardening. And the idea of hardening will be that Power BI desktop, will be able to do more. But currently there's these limitations, and I've managed to put together what I think is pretty cool demos that live totally within these limitations. So, there's a lot of promise here. Now, you have Model 1, Model 2. At first, you're thinking Model 2 can do everything, Model 1 can't, Model 2 is better. Not so fast. So what I really like about Model 1 is that you're working and making changes, to a PBX file. And then when you're done with your TOM code, you could take that PBX file, check it into GitHub or Azure DevOps, and that is your, your source of truth. Whether it's, the way that you've structured your measures, or translations, once again, checking, your completed work into source code is a good thing. So here's the issue with Model number 2. With Model number 2, if you, basically connect to a data set and make any change, and it really doesn't matter what that change is, just once you do a single write operation, to a data set, it throws up a flag, which basically prevents you from being able to download the PBX file.
Okay.
So then how can I, do something into a data set at runtime, and then capture it? And you can't do it with a PBX file. You could do it with things like the JSON format that we're going to see later. But that's, one of the limitations of Model number 2. But also Model number 2 provides great opportunities. So, for instance, my Translation Builder, I only support Model number 1. And there was just too much code for me to kind of reliably connect to data sets. But what I can do is I can use my tool to kind of make changes to the local data set, and then we'll use Christian Wade's tool, ALM Toolkit. Whatever I've changed there, I can then push those translation changes or updates to the DAX behind a measure, into our production data set without having to do anything to the underlying data. So it gets to be a very clean way to do ALM.
Sorry,
Okay.
can I interrupt you? Sorry, can I interrupt you for a second?
Absolutely.
On
We want you to understand everything here.
That last row, it says model 2, but is that all? Is that really referencing model 1?
Well,
Because I'm
model
looking at the
two,
local.
well, it's both model 1 and model 2. Okay, so
Okay.
it should be, okay.
It's kind
I
of a
knew
hybrid.
bringing Scott here would be kind of a stickler. So just to make it more correct here, we're
Just
doing
creating
model
problems for me.
1
Okay.
and model 2 put together. Yeah. So,
Okay. So it's kind of
basically,
hybrid between them. All right.
exactly right. So taking things from one and pushing it to another, or, with the ALM toolkit, you don't have to use Power BI Desktop. You could basically connect to, dataset 1 in Power BI and dataset 2 in Power BI and push changes back and forth. Once
Gotcha.
again, great tools out there. Learn to build your own tools, but don't build a tool for, something where a great tool already exists is one of the things I wanted to get across, in this first session.
Excellent.
Okay, now what we're going to look at is this tool that I wrote. And, if you look out here on GitHub, all the source code is here for you. And the idea is that you should just be able to kind of take this tool and, download it. It is a Visual Studio project, and then you should be able to start it up. And, the idea is, if I start this tool up, and I kind of made it a little bit to look like Tabular Editor. Although, Dan O has put in, 5,000 times more hours than me in building his tool, but having a tree view over here and being able to kind of see the model and then kind of use just the, property sheet in a Windows Forms application, to start looking at things, so, this is the tool that we're going to be looking at. And also, if we go over here to Power BI Desktop, to one of these, the idea is we have these different tools, we should be able to, fire this tool up and, begin using it. And what we're going to see is that, for us developers, we like to walk through our code, so we're going to have a setup where I can, basically run this tool in the Visual Studio debugger to start stepping through and debugging the code, that's part of my external tool. Okay, sounds promising, doesn't it?
Sounds great. I'm excited.
Okay, so we have this project right there. And, I've just tried to make it so you can download it, open it with Visual Studio 2022. And note, you don't need, one of the non-free versions. Just download the community version of Visual Studio 2022, and you can run this. Now, first thing we'll look at is external tool deployment. So the way that things work is that there is a special folder, and you're going to put information about where the exe file lives into a JSON file. Okay, so once again, if I look on my machine, and let's go down here to this special directory, which is where when you install, Tabular Editor, it reaches into this folder, and it adds, one of these files inside here. If we now kind of look at, what's inside of this file, it's got a name. That's the thing that, shows up here. So by, creating this, you can see, there is the name. There's a little icon inside there. So there's even a base 64 string. It's a big piece of goo that has kind of a PNG file encoded inside there. Now, when we're doing development, it's different than if you installed it, and Translation Builder kind of lives, inside your program files directory, but what's going to happen during development, is you've got this project, and as you're building, you're going to be, building into this one specific folder right here. So for instance, down here, here's the exe, for my particular tool. If I click that up, we can go ahead and start it up. So what we're going to do is, let's go back here. Let's go ahead, take this, and, let's open this just with Notepad. And one of the things that you can see here, is that we're just going to, point to, what we're building in Visual Studio. And so notice that I can start this up. Looks great. Okay, let's go back here. Let's go back here and make sure we understand the theory. If I click clean, it should basically delete that. And I go back here and, well, okay, should have found that. Okay, I failed to fail in that. Okay, there we go. So that, there's the failure, right there. But now come back here one more time, and we're going to rebuild. And so, now what we should be able to do, is to start it up. But there's one other thing here, and that is if I go back here and just start it up, I'm not launching from Visual Studio, but it still remembers the last data set that you connected to. And if it's still a live session, it will automatically connect to it. There's some kind of things inside here that we're going to, look at to make that happen.
Okay, so that external tool, that JSON file, is just a pointer to the executable, and tells it a little bit about what it's going to be, and tells it where to stick it in the ribbon there.
That's exactly
accurate?
You can't. It sticks it in the ribbon alphabetically.
Okay.
So if you want to tell the ribbon where to stick it, you start with AAA.
Very good.
Okay.
That works.
That didn't sound professional. Let me move to it. Okay. One other thing I want to point out, Scott, is that see these little arguments right here? We're also, this tells Power BI Desktop when it calls out to your application to pass some very important parameters that we're going to see.
Oh, okay.
Now, another thing I wanted to kind of do is in my application, I built it using .NET 6. I built it using Windows Forms as well. And I know, of the thousands of people that are watching this, at least, 7 just sighed, oh, gosh, Windows Forms 2002. I mean, wasn't George Bush II in office back when that was happening? Yes, it was. But Windows Forms 2 is very easy to use. Windows Forms is also one of the most Googleable technical subjects on earth because of 2 decades of very popular use. And the other thing is, if it has to run where Power BI Desktop runs, Power BI Desktop has to run on Windows. So I'm going to choose something that runs on Windows. I don't have to go to something that doesn't run in multiple places if it doesn't do me any good. Okay, so that was just me trying to justify Windows Forms in a very paranoid way.
I like it.
Let's go back here. And what's kind of neat about .NET is that it has this idea of properties. And it just gives you a very simple way to store properties for the current user. So between that, and then let's go back to the slides. It'll be a little easier if I kind of show this. What we can do is we can kind of wrap our own custom app settings class on top of this. And what's kind of neat is, so for instance, if I start up my tool and, some people might want to see everything, expand table members. Some might want to see, hidden, some don't. But the idea is when you click one of these, it stores it as a property, and now, it remembered that I wanted this checked. If I go ahead and click this off and I bring it back, so once again, I kind of built this support in so we can start tracking various properties inside here. Now, another thing that we have to do is we have to process these parameters that are being passed. So what happens is that when your application starts up, you're going to get passed these parameters as a string array. And so here's kind of the entry point, for a Windows Forms application, or it'd be similar if you did a console application. And the idea is that we're just going to take, that set of parameters and pass it over here. Now, what we're going to see is that it's going to give us, a connection string in this form of localhost and then some random port number, starting with a 5 or a 6. If you see that it contains Power BI, to me, that's a red flag because it says that this PBX file does not contain a data set. It's just the report that's bound to another data set. So then you would have to connect to that, inside the Power BI service. So here, what we're trying to do is we're trying to kind of make sure that, it's connection string to a local session. And if so, we're going to set server. And the reason we set server is that, I like to sit in Power BI Desktop and, not have to kind of start from Power BI Desktop, but to start from Visual Studio because I can set the debugger. And so here, which one's it loaded in? Product sales. And so let's try this. Let's now go to one of my other ones. Here I'll go to wingtip sales analysis. I'll click on this, but now it sets that server property. So if I go back here, it just basically says what was the last data set. And now, we've opened that other one inside here. So what I kind of find is that, if you now, want to do something, like we want to do some single stepping through code, what we're able to do is, here is the main form. I won't show this very much, but let's go ahead and, look at the code behind here. So there's code to connect, there's code to do various things. Let me go ahead and collapse this to definitions. And so the one piece of code, that might be interesting here is, populate tree. So if we come down here and, now, I set a breakpoint. That's the F9 key, Scott. Let's now go ahead and start up. And I saw that I have to close this before I can start the debugger. Let's try it one more time. And so now, and I think I've got one more error inside there. We'll need to clean out unexpected character. How'd that get there? Okay, but what I'm trying to get at is now, it gets to be, a lot easier for us to kind of come into, debug mode. Now I can start, single stepping through my code. So for instance, let's go ahead and you can kind of just see that, here's code that's just going through that tree view control, and filling it up by enumerating the object model. Okay, so let's go back to slides for a second. So what we wanted to kind of do is just kind of see how the startup works, and also the whole idea that anytime you launch something, from Power BI Desktop, we set a server application setting for the current user. And the sole purpose of that is to make it easier for us as a developer, so I can just hit the F5 key and get into the same, data model. Now, there is a Power BI Desktop Utilities class. And while I don't want to dig down very far into this, if I go down to services, you'll see that Power BI Desktop Utilities has some real low-level code. I'm not going to walk through it now, but the idea is that it uses low-level Windows APIs. It uses one API to see all the sessions of analysis services that are running. And then it uses the Windows API call to say, who is your parent? It points you to Power BI Desktop. It then scrapes the window caption off there. So for instance, up top here, it says Wingtip Sales Analysis Power BI Desktop. So we're just using this kind of duct tape approach of then just scraping off the end and putting PBIX on. Now, this is code. I didn't write this code. If you can steal code, steal it. And our buddy Dano, he's the one who wrote the code. And maybe he stole it. I'll give him credit for that too. But he's the one who kind of brought it to us. So, with this, I'd say if you like to look at painful code, go ahead and look at it. But other than that, you can just use it. And it just kind of gives you, an array. And so you can see all the active sessions on the current machine of Power BI Desktop. And you can see what's the connection string, what's the connection type. So Power BI Desktop is the only supported connection type. In the future, I might allow, Power BI service connection types, but not right now. And then it just kind of tells you the PBIX. Oh, excuse me, Scott.
Right.
Okay. Now, I also kind of wanted, not to have to start from Power BI Desktop, but if you've got three things open, being able to say connect, bring up some type of a dialogue and have you, connect to it instantly. So let's go ahead and kind of test out this working theory, and that is that, here, we bring this up and we're connected to Wingtip Sales Analysis. So let's now disconnect. Let's now connect, and it's going to use that Power BI Desktop Utilities to figure out, what are the available sessions. Here is the, the one I'd like to connect to, and we'll go ahead and connect to that. Okay, so, so far, I just kind of wanted to introduce the basic functionality, and I think anytime you're creating an external tool, you need some of these basics. Whether you want a tree view or not, that's up to you. So
now, I mean, all this code that you've written, this is all in that GitHub, and so I could theoretically, I could take that hub and then start with that basis and build off of it.
Exactly right.
All right.
Yeah, so that's the whole point. So in this section, we'll just look at some of the basics of programming with the Tabular Object Model. And then section 3, that's the one you'll be into. That's when we actually look at what are real world productive tasks, we can automate. Okay, now when we look at programming dataset object with a tabular object model, we've got this set of objects. And remember that the tabular object model came from analysis services. We have the same things, but we call them different names. So server, was originally the box, that was running, the SQL instance of analysis services. Now server is a workspace, so it is a container of data sets.
Okay.
You also have the, what we now call data set that historically is called database, tabular databases. And then for the data set, we really kind of have this outer database object and inner data model. Now, the data set, is a database object. We kind of split out the model with a model object. So here's what the object model is going to look like. I open a PBX file, and as long as it contains a data set, it has a model. It has a collection of tables, and every collection has, every table has a collection of columns and measures and hierarchies. Okay. Now, if you want to look at the demo, start by, looking at this one class called Tom API. Not the greatest name. I didn't know what to name it, Scott. So Tom API was, what I finally settled on. But I guess it's accurate, if not exciting. And you can see that, in this class, we're tracking servers. We have different things inside here. So we want to look at some of the, things, but, we have this code right here. This one code segment I just wrote, for a listing. But now, as we, come over here and I'm having trouble with my screen. There we go. Okay, let's go one more, please. Okay, so I guess the one thing here, Scott, that I want to call out is the word canonical. I love the word canonical. Always looking for times to use it. So this classic programming pattern of enumerating through all the tables. And then in the outer loop, you enumerate through tables. Then the inner loops, we're going to enumerate through the columns and the measures and hierarchies. And then each time you find a hierarchy, that has one or more levels. So you have to enumerate through those as well. So hopefully one thing that, kicking the tires on this demo will do for you is just give you a appreciation for how to discover things. Awesome. Now, a second thing we have here is that there is this JSON serializer. Now, the idea of Tom is that you can just take a data set and say, give me a JSON file with its definition. Now, if I go back to this tool right here and we come back here and say export, here are kind of the real world things that we're going to look at. So export model as model.bim. And so what that's going to do, is open this thing up. If I wanted to kind of look at it a little bit more, let's go back here. Okay, Scott, I want you to never do what I'm about to do. Go to the documents menu and open it with Visual Studio Code. Okay, but I'm a professional. Okay, but now if we look at this right here, okay, and then this isn't quite, by convention, we call these model.bim files. If I do one more thing in Visual Studio Code and I add the JSON extension, now I can see it, what it looks like, as a JSON file right here. But what we can see here is that, a lot of times, things aren't working right. And if you just bring up this JSON file right here, you're allowed to, see basically, what might be interesting or what might be causing problems. Okay, so one of the things, and I've loved Tabular Editor that allowed me to do it, but I always had to open the project and then save the file and then go to the Explorer. So I just kind of wanted this quick fix of creating it and opening it, in Notepad right off the bat. And because people like Ted, are so impatient, I created the tool for people like me. You'll find each one of these, has a keyboard shortcut, for export, Control-Shift-E, and there's my export.
Awesome.
What's the next one? Okay, how about Control-Shift-S for generate dataset model schema report? What the heck's that? Okay, Control-Shift-S. And so, what you're going to see here, is that, here, I'm going to come back to this in 1 second. I should have covered that now. But here is just this code that kind of steps through the object model. And quite often companies just need documentation. Especially, you've seen the monster data models, with 100 tables and 100 members per table, and someone's got to document that.
Right.
So here's just some kind of starter code to create, a low-tech text file, that's going to push things out. Okay, I do want to go back and pick up.
This is really useful. I've in a lot of troubleshooting sessions I've been in with, with others on our team, different people that they'll want a BIM file. They'll want to get access if they can't access the file itself. This is just really nice to be able to knock those things out quickly.
Yeah, I use it all the time. Is my formatting right? What's the formatting string? Power BI Desktop's not showing it to me, clearly. So those kind of things. The other thing I find is really useful is when you're using the Tabular Object Model and trying to build something,
right,
and you can't figure out how to do it with code, build it by hand, and then look at the JSON. And quite often, because they use these things that are called annotations.
Yeah.
Okay. And to answer your question, Scott, what is an annotation? You were about to ask that, right?
Oh, I was, yes.
Okay, I got to get to the right place here. Okay, annotations are something that's supported, in Power BI datasets, came from analysis services, but they're really just a very simple way to take anything, whether it's the model or a table or a column, and mark it with a custom attribute. So let's look at an example piece of code. So an annotation is just a name value pair. So mine is called debcam. Looks like I missed the P there. Debcam external tool demo last access at. And you can see here that what's the object? It's the top level model. I want to stick my annotation. And so what you have to figure out is, does it exist? If it exists, you overwrite the value. If it doesn't exist, you have to call new on annotation. But the idea is, I have this little piece of code that every time we start something up, let's go back here. And, if we look at the annotations, you can see, here's the one I wrote there. And it's not just me. You can see that the Power BI team, the Power BI desktop team, uses annotations as well. So as a developer, your creative brain should be thinking, I have something, do I want some type of approval process, where I use the annotation saying this measure DAX is approved. There's all kinds of creative things that you can do with the annotations.
The Bravo tool does that keeps track of which measures have been reformatted, or which ones does it need to ignore in terms of formatting. So I knew it was keeping track of it a little bit. There was putting a little bit of a note there on the measure and saying, don't bother formatting this. So I guess that's what it's doing. So this is really cool to learn how
we're going to see that. What you just talked about, we're going to cover in one of our last demos.
Awesome.
Okay, so productivity features, we already covered the first one. Let's go ahead and, generate, a report. Okay, what else? How about format strings? How about I just inherited this project, from way over the place, Willie, and, he's got 100 measures and each one has a different format string for a date. And I'm just kind of going crazy. So being able to enumerate through your object model and find, every column that is of type date time, or everything that's, if you were looking for currency, anything that was type decimal, and set things on there. Okay, let's see if we can do a quick demo for this one. Okay, so, here's something where we have these inside here. Do I have the right one open? Okay, yeah, this is product sales. So what we're going to do here is we're going to say, hey, what happens if I switch this to long time? Okay, not quite big enough, but let's go ahead and switch it to, our custom format. That's not looking like I want. Let's go back to short date. So you can see here how simple it is to write the code. So I write this reusable method, give me the format string, and I'll just walk through every column and every measure in the model, update it, and save the change. And here's the call, here's the code that calls that method. So you can see that, this gets to be an incredibly simple fix. Same thing, this is format string. What are the other properties, that you find yourself having to do, in a very painful, tedious way to go do the same property set, on tens or hundreds of
decimal
objects.
Places and adding the commas.
Yeah.
Constantly doing that.
Good stuff. Okay, I think I still got you engaged here. How about this one? Create a calendar table. And this is Duo does this, or Bravo does this.
Bravo does it.
So I'm doing some of the things that Bravo does.
Yeah. And it's a cool way to do it.
let's see how this works. So let's say I drop down dataset operations and I have all these nice commands, but I see create calendar table from date column is grayed out. Why is that? I don't have a date column selected. Okay, I'll pick a measure, still grayed out. But now we pick a date column. Okay, now I have 3 daughters, so I like to be dramatic, Scott. So we're going to go back here. And now, what we're going to do is we're going to come back here and we're going to say, create a calendar table, from this inside here. And what you can see behind the scenes is that it creates this calendar table, automatically. So this code right here, it's a little bit hard to see. So, let's go back.
But it created it and put the relationship in and everything. Very nice.
Yes. Without the relationship, we'd just be men without direction. No, I was talking about our wives. Oh, no. We would be, Cartesian products, just as bad as men, without direction. So here, calendar table, we're passing a date column, so I just kind of have ways that I'm kind of building the table inside here. What you can see is I have a DAX expression. So I kind of have this technique here where, I'm able to kind of put a text file, and notice that we have kind of a placeholder right here. So this code, is just basically grabbing that and replacing that placeholder with the name of the table that we want to do this on. And, I've done this, where in Power BI desktop, I kind of found the technique where you can keep this DAX statement and you can copy and paste it in, and that gets you 70% of the way there. But then after that, you still got to go and set things like sort columns. Right. So what's kind of neat about this, is after we create the table, we can kind of mark the table as a timetable. So Excel knows that, this is the date table. But what you can also see down here, is that, this kind of just takes all the different columns and puts some in display folders. So up top here, you can kind of see, what we've got after. I've tried to kind of make something which is nice, for report view. So we kind of thought about time periods. Let's put them in their own, display. Let's go ahead and have, a hierarchy of our date table. If we go ahead and
hidden the sort names.
Yeah, so we got the sorting worked out. Nice. If we come back up here and we'll start with some sales revenue, and now we'll take our hierarchy and we'll add that inside here. Maybe take days of week, and we'll add that inside. So what we can see here, is that it just kind of gives us neat drill down capabilities. And once again, the Bravo project kind of does this, and they have kind of a little bit more. But what I want to do is just give you a very general starting point. And some people have very specific, date timetables that start on November 13th.
Right.
Maybe not November 13th, but they don't start at the first of the year. And so when you have to kind of add this logic to 100 PBX projects over the next year, just having a piece of code to automate that, seems like a really good idea.
Oh, that's fantastic, Ted.
And once again, if you kind of look at this, we're also able to, make the relationships. Okay. Next thing we're going to look at is doing an export. So let's say that, we're working with our tool right here. We have some tables right here, so, maybe what I'd like to be able to do, is take one of my tables and just, do an export table, as CSV file. So there's just kind of a quick way to get those here. Kind of things that I'll talk about here is that in order to do this, there is something which is called the ADOMD, multidimensional client, and it's named for 20 years ago, but it's what we use when we want to execute DAX queries against the XMLA endpoint. If I do a quick tangent here and I come back up here, what you'll see is that, this, for all practical purposes, is the tabular object model. But if you want to run queries, you're going to need this as well. But what we have here, is something where we create a query, and we're just saying, give me all rows and all columns. One other thing, when you do this and you start parsing together a CSV file and you have 100,000 rows, don't use the regular string type, use string builder. You'll see incredible performance degradation if you take a string and you start parsing it together. And then the idea is we execute the query, we loop through the results, and we're just basically taking the string builder and building all this CSV content. And then we're going to, basically spit it out to a CSV file and open it in Excel. And just, the proof is in the pudding. If we go back to sales, which is a larger table, and then we say, export as CSV file. And now once that comes out, let's go, to the very end. What do we got down here, Scott? We're looking like almost 200,000 rows.
Nice.
So once again, just kind of gives you, and it's going to be as performant, as your desktop machine is. Okay, two more things we want to show. So let's say that we have this requirement, and our requirement is to generate a bunch of measures. And when we generate these measures, it's going to be a repeatable process that's going to take a lot of work if we do it by hand, and it's going to be much easier, if we, do it with code. So with this, I'm going to start with a brand new project right here. Now, if I now, go to external tools and I open this up, what you'll see right here is that there are these two grayed out menus. These don't enable until you have tables that have specific names. So what we're going to do is we're going to come to recent sources, and I'm going to create this table, and this table has to have a specific name for this to work. And my demo has it set up, translated report label matrix. And what we have here is we have kind of a label ID, and then we have English, Spanish, French, and German. And now that we have this inside here, what we have is we have this set of data. And if we look over here, just to kind of take a look at what it looks like, okay, that's interesting. So now we're going to go back to our tool, and we're going to see still not lit up. Note that when you make changes in Power BI desktop, they're not automatically pushed here, which is why we have this little sync data model. But now that we've done that, we should see that this lights up. Once again, to be dramatic and impress my daughters, I'm going to come back here. And now we're going to say, generate translated report label matrix measures. So what you'll see, is that, on the fly, it is able to run a query, and from that query, kind of build these measures inside here. Let's go back now to our report. And, if I kind of take a look at, in data view, and we kind of see everything, do we really need these columns? Let's go ahead and hide those. So as I move over here, what you'll see is that I have a bunch of static measures and dynamic measures. And we want these to be easy to use in a shape, or, even easier in a card. Let's kind of take this, let's go ahead and add it inside here. But what you'll see here is that, this has a switch statement to look at user culture. What language does this user speak? And, it automatically does a lookup, into the table, depending, on that value. Okay.
Very nice.
Let's go one more step. This dynamic measures. How about static measures? If your code can see everything, why can't it just, why do we have to do the lookup? So there might be differences, in the fact that if you do static and anything changes, you have to rebuild them. If you do these dynamic measures and you re-import data, as long as you're not introducing new IDs or, new languages, it will still work. So once again, just wanted to kind of show an example, of basically taking data, using, the user culture function to generate, measures dynamically. So we execute a query just to see what's there, and then we're able to kind of build these on the fly. Okay.
Very cool.
One more thing here. Just go ahead, Scott.
No, it's very cool. I'm just fascinated with the amount of power this thing that you're harnessing to tackle all kinds of problems that I can see developers needing to, especially if you're, it's fine to do this one report at a time if you're just doing ad hoc reports. But if you're trying to set up a standard across an organization so that every report you step into has a calendar table that's kind of structured the way you're expecting it, or your translations are structured in a clean and reproducible way, or you want to make sure that everybody's kind of playing by the same rules on the reports. This is an incredible way of helping make the standardization easier. So, I mean, I just kind of an application of what you're showing here. Very cool.
Good stuff. Okay, let's keep going. Now, we've kind of seen, generating those measures. There's a lot of code behind there that does that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I don't want to get too deep into the code because we have limited time left. But what you'll see here is that there's these generate translated report label measures, and you kind of see that. I also have this set of helper methods inside here that are looking through and building how many columns are inside there. So once again, it could be tedious work to put this together, but you got a nice payoff.
Yeah.
Okay, the next thing that we're going to do is we're going to look at this format DAX for model. Okay, so let's go back into one of these other models right here. So we'll go back to our product sales, and with this particular model, let's make sure we have our tool started up. And so let's say we have DAX code inside here, and our DAX code is not all that great in the fact it's formatted. So there is some people that we all know very well, which are the folks at SQL BI. So a couple years ago, they stood up a public anonymous access API called the DAX Formatter API. So first, a call out to SQL BI. That's an awesome resource that you've given to developers. Now, we have code that calls it. If you use Bravo, they call it. I think Tim or Phil Seamark, had me create this sample, when we did a session, back in 2020. But I wanted to bring it up again here because it uses a neat technique. The idea is that we're going to call out, and what you'll see here is the COM API class just has one method, format DAX for model, and you're going to pass that. But there's a bunch of utility classes down here, like the request body, and this basically takes a .NET object and serializes it into JSON to put the request across. Here's the response that comes back. So I'll let you dig into this stuff if you want. What I want to kind of show is, if I have a certain number of these DAX expressions through here. Okay, let's go back here, and what you're going to see is, where did we have DAX expressions? Well, measures, obviously, calculated tables, calculated columns. So if we look at this code, you can see that it steps through the measures, it steps through the columns and finds out which columns are calculated, and then it's going to call across a network. Okay, so here's a demo that Scott would never do, and that is I'm going to bring up my best friend Fiddler. And with Fiddler open, let's go ahead and close this out. Okay, somewhere here I can say remove all. Okay, so now, with this particular tool, and let's make sure I only have one of these open and not connected to the right one. So let's go ahead and reconnect to the one we're using, product sales. Okay, so what we're going to do now, and let me just make sure I have something that's awkward that needs fixing. Okay, so I think finally I've got the demo set up. So now what we're going to do, and Scott's saying, wait, you forgot Fiddler. Okay, so now finally, let's go back down here. And what we're going to do is we're going to say format DAX expressions. And what you'll see is for every single one of these, it's going to go ahead and it's going to call across a network. It's going to say hello to Marco and Alberto on the way over. And as it comes back, what you can see, is we have the formatted DAX expression inside here. So now we're able to kind of write them inside here. But what's going to happen now? So think about how nice Marco and Alberto are, and I just formatted 1,000 measures, and I make one small change to one, and then reformat all 1,000. We don't want to do that.
Right.
So what we're going to do here is, if I go export model, another good use of this, and we go down and we start looking at something with a DAX expression, you'll see that we're going to add hash expressions. Now, the way that this works, once you kind of understand at a logical level, is that we have this cryptographic method. Sergey would love this one. Is we hash data. So there is a SHA1 class. And the idea is, if you take a huge string and you hash it, it gives you a small value. And if you ever take the exact same string and you hash it, it gives you the exact same value. But if there's any differences, it gives you a different value. So what we can do here is we can simply look at the existing expression and hash it, and then compare it to what we hashed last time. So once again, watch kind of the result of this. And that is, I come back here and, we basically, just break one more thing. And, now that we have broken that one thing, let's bring this back up here. I like truth in demoing. And then finally, we'll come back here. And, what we're going to see here is when we kind of do a DAX format expression, this time it should only result in one call. I didn't hit enter there, I guess. Okay, now that I've hit enter, okay. Yeah. We might or might not get this demo currently. Okay, but now you can kind of see only one DAX expression was reformatted because
that's the only one that has. That's the only one where the hash doesn't match the form of the DAX itself.
That's correct.
And so, it
we have
says, okay,
we have a thing we say as developers: if you can't read the hash value, put down the hash pipe and leave the hash bar. Okay, just kidding.
Okay.
Or let's go ahead and keep
scatter, smother, and cover it.
Into this is now into the home stretch. So let's say that, I have a project and some guy didn't understand dynamic RLS. So he has 1,200 roles in the project that I have to remove one by one. So I want to remove all the roles, or I want to add roles programmatically. Or I want to add the exact same set of roles, to 50 PBX files. So what we have here is, something where, let's go to home. Let's now go back up, into where do I want to go now? I want to go here. I want to go modeling, and I want to look at roles. And currently we have no roles. So back here, inside of our project, go to external tools. We'll bring this up, and note that if I come down here, this will also show you roles that live inside there. And if I want to, delete all the roles, or if I want to, add more roles back in, and then come back here, and we'll go to, manage roles. And what you could see here, I'm able to, do the kind of same things I would do by hand. So once again, all that type of stuff, can be automated. Okay, so what I wanted to do in that section, is just kind of give, specific things. So I thought, export, build a schema, change date formatting, create a calendar table, export CVS, generate measures on the fly, reformat DAX, and create RLS roles. It's kind of a good sampling of the kind of things that you can do with this tool set.
Very cool.
Now let's go ahead, and there's one more section, and that's going to be, if you're building multi-language reports. So one of the things that Tom allows you to do, is to add metadata translations. When you create a new project, it has one default language and locale, what we call a culture, something like ENUS. And so what you need to do to add multi-language support is to add secondary languages, and to add metadata translations. So Power BI Desktop doesn't give you any tools, to work with metadata translations. So what are your options? Tabular editor is a way to do it. And, with tabular editor, you're either doing it manually, which is very tedious, or you can write scripts. You can develop an external tool like we've done here, or you can use the one, that I built and we showed in last month's session called Translation Builder. So Translation Builder, was built specifically, for working with metadata translations. Let's say that I go back into Power BI Desktop, and with my particular tool here, we'll go to External Tools. We'll go to Translation Builder, and if you want to see more about this tool, you should look at what we had last time. But the whole idea is that you're able to add languages and go down and basically add Spanish translations. That's kind of the whole point of this particular tool. Now, once again, if you want to use this as a user, I would say look at the January session of Power BI Dev Camp, and there's lots of documentation we have to go use it. But there are a couple of reasons why you might want to extend it as a developer. So I know we're getting kind of close to the witching hour here, but once again, if you go to Translation Builder, it has all the source code that you could load in. And things about Translation Builder is that, let's go to its user guide. So I wanted to kind of point out some of the scope and limitation. So supported dataset editing scenarios. Number one, it only supports going right to Power BI Desktop. So can you use Translation Builder to go across the network and connect to a live data set? No, it doesn't generally support that. But some developers might be willing to, take over the project to get that capability. Also supported languages. The way that I did things, you have this idea of a culture in Power BI. So English has a language and a locale. For various reasons, I made an assumption where we can only have one locale per language. So that means that if you want Spanish, you have to do it in Spanish ES in Spain. What if you want Spanish in Mexico? It doesn't support that. In many cases, it will work out just fine without it. But there could be cases that you would want to, take over things. So if I go back here, and now we open up Translations Builder, it's the exact same thing, where I could, now go ahead and open it up from Visual Studio, but under models, under supported languages, here's all the language supported, so it won't be that hard to come in here, and swap out the languages that I have, by coming down here, and having, English, GB,
Right.
instead of English US. So that's kind of the main thing that I wanted to kind of show, that Translations Builder is there for you to use as a user, but it's also there for you to extend as a developer. Once again, if you kind of see that you want to add features or doesn't support something, that you want inside there.
Very cool.
And that takes us to the end of our session today.
Ted, that is awesome. I learn so much from you every time I talk. Every time I get on these things with you, it's amazing, and I can just see how many different ways somebody could take the basis or that project you started with and take it and adapt it to solve some specific problem that they have in their organization. And like I said, the standardization or normalization of different tools there. Very cool. Thank you for sharing all this.
Thank you for being here, being the sidekick, having some fun with us.
Well done, man.
And playing the part of a human as opposed to a software developer. It's very nice of you to play that role for us today.
Do you have the link for that the GitHub again? That'd be nice to make sure that everybody has that available.
GitHub, so the best place to start with is just to go to github.com Power BI Dev Camp.
Great.
And that will show you all the different repositories. So the Dev Camp external tool demo, is going to be the first one in there. but also Translation Builder I have kind of pinned to the top as my favorite GitHub project I have for customers these days.
Very nice.
What do we got next month? Next month we have some best practices and guidance on Power BI embedding. So just kind of a collection from 2 or 3 years of working with it. And that should take us to next month.
Have a great afternoon.